The air on the weeping willow plantation was always thick, a heavy broth of humidity and decay that clung to the back of the throat. It was a place where grandeur was a thin veneer over a festering core, where the white columns of the main house stood not as testaments to elegance, but as pale, bony fingers grasping at a sky that offered no rain. Inside, in a room choked with the scent of beeswax and old roses, Silas Croft watched his daughter, Lucinda. She was a vast, sorrowful creature, Lucinda, spilling over the confines of her velvet chaise lounge. Her obesity was a silent, monstrous presence in the house, a testament to a father's indulgence and secret shame. He saw her not as a daughter, but as a flawed sculpture, a testament to his own decaying line. In the deep, whiskey-blurred hours of the night, a solution, monstrous in its simplicity, had taken root in his mind. He sent for Solomon. The man was not called a slave in Silas's thoughts. He was a tool, a resource, like the fertile soil by the river. Solomon was a man of quiet hands and quieter eyes, who knew the old ways of root and bone, who could set a limb or brew a tea that could either bring a fever down or send it raging. He was a man who understood the body's secrets, its levers, and its breaking points. Silas did not make a request. He presented a situation, his words circling the horror like carrion birds. "The girl is unwell," he said, standing by the window, his back to Solomon. "Her form, it is a sickness. A burden to her prospects. I understand you have certain knowledge. I would see her made well. Made right." Solomon stood in the shadowed part of the room, his gaze fixed on the massive, trembling form of the young mistress. He did not look at Silas. He saw the girl's eyes, wide with a dumb, animal fear. He felt the weight of the unspoken thing in the room, the transaction of flesh. His own family, his wife and boy, were out there in the quarters. Their futures were phantoms, easily snuffed out. He spoke a single word, his voice a low rumble, like earth shifting. "Yes." That night, Lucinda was taken not to a doctor, but to the old smokehouse, a place that still held the ghostly tang of cured meat and ashes. Solomon worked by the light of a single lantern, its flame throwing leaping, distorted shadows onto the walls. He did not speak to her of diets or purges. He brought in poultices of strange, bitter herbs that stained the skin a yellowish green. He prepared tinctures that made her sleep a thick, suffocating sleep, where her dreams were not of cakes and compresses, but of dark, moist earth and things growing in the silence. He began to manipulate her body, his strong, knowing hands pressing, kneading, and contorting the great mounds of her flesh. It was not an act of violence, but of terrifying reconfiguration. He would press certain points on her spine until her breath hitched, and a strange, cold energy seemed to seep into her limbs. He would bind parts of her torso with strips of linen soaked in pungent bruise, the fabric tightening like a second skin as it dried. Weeks passed. The change was not one of healthy slimming, but of a grotesque distillation. The softness of her melted away, not to reveal bone, but something harder, more defined. Her face, once a plump moon, became a stark landscape of sharp cheekbones and a gaunt, hungry jaw. Her eyes, once fearful, now held a flat, predatory stillness. She moved with a new, unsettling economy, a silence that was not her own. She was being unmade, her father's shame scraped away to reveal something far, far older. And Solomon, watching his creation take shape, knew the true work was only just beginning. The master had asked for his daughter's body to be remade, and Solomon, with the patience of the land itself, was obeying. He was returning her to the earth, one twisted sinew at a time. The oppressive stillness of the study was a physical presence, thick with the scent of old leather and the sweet, cloying aroma of Silas's fine brandy. He did not look at Solomon as the man entered, his focus instead on the swirling amber liquid in his glass, as if the answers to his grotesque dilemma might be found in its depths. The silence between them was not empty, It was charged with the unspoken history of the plantation, a ledger of power and subjugation. Silas finally spoke, his voice a low, measured thing that belied the revulsion festering in his gut. He did not speak of his daughter's health, not truly, nor of her happiness. He spoke of her form as a farmer might speak of a prize sow that had grown too large for its pen, a flawed asset that required correction. His words were carefully chosen, orbiting the brutal, unutterable core of his proposition. He called Lucinda's condition a sickness, a burden to her prospects, linguistic fig leaves meant to conceal the naked cruelty of his intent. He was a man who dealt in transactions of cotton, of land, of human flesh, and this was merely another. He acknowledged Solomon's certain knowledge, a vague yet potent reference to the whispered secrets of roots and remedies that existed just beneath the surface of the plantation's civilized veneer. The phrase "I would see her made well, made right," was the crucial pivot. In that repetition, the meaning twisted. Well implied health, but right implied conformity, an erasure of the offending shape that so deeply shamed him. It was in the space between those two words that the pact was forged. He never explicitly asked for his daughter to be starved, carved, or reshaped. He simply presented his problem and gestured toward the man he owned as the solution, cloaking a monstrous request in the language of paternal concern and pragmatic necessity. Solomon's understanding was not required, it was assumed, compelled by the unyielding hierarchy that governed their lives. The offer was a trapdoor concealed in the floor of polite conversation, and both men knew that to step onto it was to fall into a darkness from which there would be no return. The negotiation was complete without a single direct demand, the fate of a young woman sealed by what was left unsaid, her body becoming the silent currency in a transaction of power between two men, one who saw her as a disgrace and the other who saw her as a vessel for something else entirely. Solomon stood in the shadowed study, the master's words hanging in the air like a physical weight. The request, for all its civilized phrasing, was a barbed hook, and he felt it lodge deep within him. His gaze, which had not wavered from the massive, trembling form of the young mistress, now turned inward, calculating with a cold, desperate precision. To refuse was an unthinkable act of defiance, a direct challenge to the absolute power Silas Croft wielded. The consequences would be immediate and brutal, falling not only upon him but upon his wife, Elara, and their young son, Isaiah, their fragile existence on the plantation snuffed out with a single command. Yet, to agree was to become an instrument of a different kind of horror, to use the knowledge passed down through generations, knowledge of healing, of the subtle balances within the body, for a purpose that felt like a profound desecration. In the suffocating silence of that room, a terrible calculus began. He saw the faces of his family, the fear in their eyes a constant companion, and he weighed that fear against the monstrous task being laid before him. He understood that within this grotesque demand, there might exist a sliver of leverage, a fleeting chance to manipulate the situation to his own ends. Perhaps compliance could be bartered for a promise, however fragile, of slightly better conditions, an extra ration, a warmer blanket for the winter, or even, in the most secret, guarded chamber of his heart, the whispered possibility of a future concession that could not yet be named. The girl, Lucinda, was already a prisoner of her flesh and her father's disdain. Her fate seemed sealed by the very world they inhabited. His own family's fate, however, was a thread he could still attempt to pull, however slightly. His agreement, therefore, was not one of submission, but of a strategic, soul-withering capitulation. It was a choice to navigate a path through two certain evils, selecting the one that offered a ghost of a chance for those he loved. The single, guttural yes that escaped his lips was not an affirmation of the task, but a testament to the brutal economy of survival. It was the sound of a man stepping into a moral abyss, believing it to be the only bridge across a more immediate chasm of destruction, committing to a dark alchemy where his skills would be perverted to serve a master's vanity, all while clinging to the desperate, fragile hope that from this act of damnation, A seed of salvation for his own might somehow, impossibly, grow. The transformation that took place in the confines of the old smokehouse was a perversion of nature, a process of grotesque distillation that defied Silas's shallow expectations of a simple slimming cure. Solomon's methods, a secretive amalgamation of enforced purges, potent herbal tinctures that soured the blood, and physical manipulations that seemed to reknit the very sinew and bone, did not carve away Lucinda's softness to reveal a healthier form. Instead, they scraped it away to uncover something altogether different, something hardened and alien. The fat, which had once rendered her a figure of passive bulk, melted off not to reveal the delicate frame of a southern belle, but a gaunt, almost architectural structure of sharp angles and taut, wiry muscle. Her face, once a plump and pale moon, became a stark landscape of jutting cheekbones and a jaw that seemed sharp enough to cut, her eyes receding into deep, shadowed sockets where they now burned with a flat, predatory stillness. The change was more than physical, it was a fundamental rewiring of her being. The lethargic despair that had once defined her was replaced by a terrifying, kinetic silence. She moved with a new, unsettling economy, her steps making no sound on the packed earth floor, her presence seeming to suck the warmth from the air around her. The herbal concoctions Solomon forced past her lips did more than suppress appetite. They pulled her consciousness down into a twilight state where the boundaries between dream and waking blurred, filling her mind with visions of dark, moist soil and gnarled, grasping roots, as if the very essence of the land was seeping into her soul. Her father's desired correction had become a monstrous unveiling. The spoiled, indolent girl was being systematically erased, and what was emerging in her place was a creature of stark, elemental hunger, her body reshaped into a vessel for a cold, patient fury that was no longer directed inward, but outward, toward the world that had created her. She was no longer the object of her father's shame, but a living embodiment of the plantation's own hidden rot, a spectre of sharp bones and chilling intent, her humanity stripped away to reveal the grim anatomy of a revenge she did not yet know she would exact. The shift was as subtle and as definitive as the changing of a season. The being that Lucinda had become, a creature of sharp bones and chilling quiet, no longer cowered in the shadowy corners of the smokehouse or flinched at the sound of her father's voice. The fear that had once been a constant, cold companion had been burned away in the crucible of her transformation, replaced by a deep, glacial understanding. She now saw Silas Croft not as a figure of terrifying authority, but as the architect of her new, painful reality. He was the source, the prime mover of the poultices that stung her skin, the bruise that twisted her guts, and the hands that had remade her into this gaunt spectre. Her gaze, which had once been downcast and pleading, now followed him with the flat, unblinking focus of a predator assessing its prey, and the vast, decaying house of Weeping Willow was no longer her prison but her territory. The polished floors of the grand hall became a landscape she navigated with unnerving silence, her presence felt as a sudden drop in temperature, a flicker of movement at the edge of one's vision. The power dynamic, once rigid and absolute, had been inverted. Silas, who had orchestrated this entire horror from a position of untouchable command, began to feel the first pricks of a terror he could not name. He would find her standing perfectly still in a moonlit corridor, her skeletal frame casting a long, distorted shadow, her head tilted as if studying a curious insect. The oppressive heat of the plantation seemed to retreat from her, leaving a pocket of chill air in her wake. The servants, both enslaved and free, gave her a wide berth, speaking in hushed tones of the thin lady and the bad luck that clung to her. She had become an active force, a manifestation of the land's own grim sentience, and her attention was now fixed upon the man who had set this awful process in motion. The hunt, though silent and without overt violence, had begun. She was no longer the victim of a cruel experiment, she was its most dire and unforeseen consequence, a weapon honed by her father's own vanity and now turning, with patient, inexorable intent, back upon its creator. The plantation, with its whispering fields and groaning trees, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when her understanding would translate into action, when the spectre would finally reach out a bone-thin hand to claim its due. The culmination was not a confrontation in the grand hall, nor a violent struggle beneath the weeping willow trees. It was a quiet, almost ritualistic consummation that unfolded in the deep of night, revealing the true and hidden purpose behind Solomon's grim labors. Silas Croft, drawn by a sound he could not name, a dry rustling like dead leaves skittering across floorboards, found his daughter not in her bed, but in the library, standing before the cold hearth. She was unnervingly still, her gaunt form a stark silhouette against the grey ashes, and she was not alone. Solomon stood in the corner, not as a subordinate, but as a presiding figure, his work finally complete. There was no anger in his eyes, only a terrible, ancient resolve. The process he had enacted was never about obedience or even revenge in its simple form. It was a transmutation, an act of grim, ecological justice. He had not simply reshaped Lucinda's body, he had infused it with the essence of the land itself, the same land Silas had worked, bled, and profited from for decades. As Silas stood frozen, a creeping paralysis took root in his limbs, a coldness that spread from the floorboards up through the soles of his fine leather boots. Tendrils of what appeared to be dark, gnarled vine, slick with a spectral dew, emerged from the shadows, not to bind him, but to seek him, coiling around his ankles with a gentle, inexorable pressure. He tried to cry out, but his breath was stolen by the scent of rich, wet earth and decay that now filled the room. Lucinda turned her head, and in her hollow eyes, he saw not his daughter, but the cold, patient life of the swamp, the relentless pull of the grave, the final harvest. This was Solomon's true work, to make the master a part of the soil he had claimed to own, to return his body to the earth not in burial, but in a grotesque and immediate union. The vines tightened, pulling not with brute force, but with the slow, undeniable certainty of roots cracking stone, drawing him down into the very floorboards, which had softened to the consistency of deep, hungry mud. His fate was not to be murdered, but to be reclaimed, his wealth, his power, his very name rendered meaningless as he was absorbed into the silent, enduring darkness from which he had tried to profit, a final, poetic justice that served a balance far older than any ledger of human sin.